data. It's the building block of our understanding. It helps us make informed decisions, measure progress, and understand the world around us. And there's more than ever before. From tracking COVID-19 to firefighting, to sea ice in the Arctic, from our current population to our growth story, from housing to inflation to schools and healthcare, it paints a portrait of Canada by the numbers. Reliance on high-quality data is now an integral part of public policy. And in our data-driven future, the fundamental role of statistics and the public function of data have never been more vital. But the latest data from Statistics Canada is revealing our country is at a crossroads. Canada is in the midst of an identity shift. As we face challenges ahead and reckon with our past, we as a country, government, the private sector, academia, media, are all grappling with how best to govern, responsibly utilize, monetize, and deal with data. For more than 100 years, Statistics Canada has been harnessing the power of data to help make better decisions. The agency is a key asset for Canada to leverage.
We are a key player and component of this data ecosystem. It's an important role, arbiter of quality, trustworthy information, and data steward. It's a challenge and an opportunity. The richer array of available data sources has increased our power to provide more timely and relevant information to policy and decision makers, and in turn, to all Canadians.
Today, Statistics Canada is the country's most comprehensive and trusted source of information. It uses a variety of methods to compile data, not just surveys, but administrative records, responsible data sharing agreements, and more. From data management to innovation, from partnership to our leadership role as a data steward here in Canada and internationally, the agency continues to push ahead. The agency was already well on its modernization journey, but COVID-19 accelerated its plans. Canadians needed the agency to step up, and it rose to the challenge, showing leadership here at home and on the international stage. From wastewater tracking to the distribution of personal protective equipment, in the early days of the pandemic, the agency was able to be nimble in Canada's time of need, and there's more to do. As the country faces social and economic challenges, more is being done to capture data about our diverse nation and the many complex intersections of identity. The challenges of our digital era also present opportunities for innovation. We all have a role to play in harnessing the power of data responsibly. A robust data ecosystem allows us to have quality, timely, relevant data, helping us make informed decisions. This data ecosystem is essential in helping us address key challenges and moving our society and economy forward in a time of uncertainty and change.
Statistics Canada's data-driven insights support the decisions that governments, organizations, businesses, and all Canadians make every single day. These are decisions that affect our future as a country. We know that better data lead to better outcomes for us and for generations to come. Thank you. So for my first dance number, Elder McGregor, thank you, Miigwech. I want to start off by acknowledging that we are on the traditional lands, the unceded and unsurrendered lands of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. They have been the caretakers of our Ottawa River watershed, and they have welcomed nations, and I thank you for them. Take a minute and just recognize where we are.
Mon collègue Taiki Sarantakis et tous des amis dévoués à l'École de la fonction publique du Canada, merci. Merci pour le grand honneur qui me fait de présenter la conférence Mannion aujourd'hui. John Mannion était connu pour son profond attachement au service public et je lui rends hommage et je salue Dr. Mannion ici qui est avec nous aujourd'hui. Merci. Merci d'être ici. Friends and colleagues, I feel like some of you are with me here on the stage today because you have shaped my thinking, and I want to thank you for that. A couple members of my family are here as well. Thank you for being the wind in my sails. And lastly, let me tell you, talking to all of you is simple. I have a few colleagues here from Statistics Canada, and they're like subject matter experts. And so every single number that I'm going to share with you, they're going to scrutinize. So, so don't let them heckle too much. Well, it's actually this. Okay. So, look, if you take nothing away from the conversation today, it is this, that we are at an inflection point. In a sense, we're going to end an era, and we're about to start a new one. And I don't want to be overly dramatic, but I think if you look at our data, all the time series are being disrupted in a way that we haven't seen before. And so in a sense, it's really hard to see patterns that were there before and have models and forecast and say with certainty, this is what's going to happen next. And that is really an important juncture that we are on. And many of you I know are my colleagues in the policy-making area. It's hard making policy when the country's future rests on the decisions that we make. To some, well, this is uplifting. But to some, let me tell you, it's terrifying. But that's where we are. And I've always believed that the future is not something that we drift into. It's something we shape and we drive forward with. And so we're not helpless in this journey. Yes, you see the technological change, you see the social change, you see the environmental challenges that we've got, and you see the economic challenges that we've got. The one thing that is without a doubt truth is the speed at which things are changing. It is continuously speeding up. And so today in my talk, I want to focus on 4 things. First, on demography. Secondly, I'm going to talk a little bit about immigration and its role and how it's shaping demography. The economy, of course, and how it's in transition. And then, of course, the role of data, the critical role of data. I would say that demography is destiny. And you'll see that throughout the course of the talk today. As the old saying goes, if you don't know where you've come from, any road will do. Let me kind of turn back a little bit and talk a little bit about our history. We're a country of immigrants. At the turn of the 20th century, we saw huge in-migration into Canada. Between 1901 and 1911, we actually grew at an annual rate of 3%. And at that point, the old saying, go west. Well, that's exactly where things were being settled, is the West. In fact, as the Western provinces started to come into Confederation, it was a condition that they be included in a 5-yearly census, and we actually include the census of agriculture on top of that. By 1911, we had grown to 7.2 million. Incidentally, just for your information, today, the number of immigrants in Canada is 8.3 million. So we saw huge increases in the lands that were ceded out west. We saw a booming manufacturing sector. We saw internal consumption increase. And we saw our mining sector take off. Well, of course, after that, like many other countries, we did not escape the Great Depression. It was a difficult period in Canada. We saw immense deflation. We saw people losing their lives and livelihoods. We saw economic and social turmoil during the 30s. And it was at that time that governments took on a very active and a very aggressive role in our society and in our economies. And you saw also, because of the suffering, the introduction of social welfare programs. Incidentally, the Dominion Bureau of Statistics came into being in 1918 and the Bank of Canada in 1935. Après la Seconde Guerre mondiale, une période de croissance démographique massive a permis à notre économie de bénéficier d'un secteur manufacturier robuste et des exportations de nos ressources naturelles. Le gouvernement estimait qu'il était essentiel d'accroître notre population pour maintenir notre puissance industrielle et disposer d'une base fiscale solide, nécessaire pour maintenir les mesures de protection sociale adoptées à la fin de la guerre. We developed the system of national accounts working internationally. And we were one of the first ones in this country to adopt it. And the system of national accounts allowed us to get a much greater understanding of the economy and its various components and the various sectors of the industry. In fact, the SNA, the System of National Accounts, along with the Census, is the foundation on which finance actually bases its equalization and transfer payments on. Well, after the war, our soldiers came back. There was a real concern about how are we going to integrate them into the employment of our country, and how are we going to measure the unemployment. And in fact, in 1945, that gave birth to the Labor Force Survey. It was the first major survey that Canada undertook where we introduced sampling. And we opened up operational offices all across the country, regional service centers that we call them today. And that increased our reach and our impact in Canada. And in fact, I started in one of those regional offices in Edmonton, not in 1945, in case you're wondering. It was a little bit later on in 1988. And today, we have close to 400 different survey programs in this country. Well, following the war, as you all know, we had the baby boom, right? And on top of that, we had increased immigration. We grew as a country from 12 million people in 1945 to 16 million by the mid-1950s. Italy, Greece, Portugal, and Southern Europe were where people came from to settle. And in fact, they shaped the social economic fabric of this country in the post-war era. It was the first time that we saw household incomes increase because we had multiple income earners in every household. Women made an impressive 24% of the labor force back then. And we were shifting. We were shifting from an agriculture economy, a farming economy, into more of an industrial economy. We were moving from the rural areas and the farm areas into our urban centers. And that was a time that we saw massive construction. We saw nuclear plants, we saw freeways, we saw chemical plants, and we saw an explosion of development and infrastructure. Sous la direction de Premier ministre Pearson, nous avons obtenu un drapeau national, le régime de pension du Canada, un régime national d'assurance maladie, et pour les fonctionnaires fédéraux, le droit à libre négociation collective. In fact, in 1967, we made a pretty massive shift in our immigration policy. We introduced the points system. In fact, that change was massive, and it shaped the nature of this country in a very fundamental way. And in a sense, today, we are at the start of another massive wave of immigration. And frankly, the pace is unlike anything that we have seen before. It is dizzying. 2022 saw the largest influx of immigrants coming to Canada, 1 million plus. 400,000 that were permanent and 600,000 that were temporary. And as you know, many of the temporary immigrants end up staying in this country after as well. In just a few short weeks, we will pass the 40 million mark in this country. Let me just compare our situation with a couple other countries. Firstly, Japan. It's got the lowest births ever recorded this last year. Their fertility rate is 1.3. You need 2.1 to keep the population steady. They closed this past year 430 schools. Their labor force participation has dropped from 70% in 1993 to 59% this last year. The burden of those who are working, who have to support those that are not, that are mainly aged, by many is seen to be unsustainable. Their share of debt to GDP is the highest in the world. And more than 90,000 people are over the age of 100. 90,000 centenarians. And the foreign resident population, because as you know, they have a different attitude towards immigrants, is just 2.29%. Let's take Italy. The population of Italy has been dropping steadily since 2014. Their fertility rate is 1.24. Their labor force participation is 61%. And their foreign resident population is just over 8.6%. They will lose a fifth of their population by 2050. Now let's look at ours. Our fertility rate is 1.4. Not that far off. Our labor force participation is 66%. But the big difference here is immigration. 23% of Canadians are immigrants. And by the way, we're still growing older as a country, even with immigration. The temporary population today in Canada is equivalent to the Indigenous population at 1.8 million. Just think about that for a minute. Between 2016 and 2021, our census showed that we grew at a rate of 5.3%, the highest in the G7. Our Indigenous population grew at almost twice that rate, at 9.4%. In 2022, we grew by 2.7% alone, as I mentioned earlier. 96% of our growth, 96, pretty well everybody, is because of immigration. If we keep that rate of growth, it's like compounding interest, in the next 26 years, we will double our population. 26 years is a blink in our history. It's a generation. So let's break this down some more. Who is coming to Canada? Who is coming into this country? 1 out of every 4 people come from Europe or the British Isles or the United States. 62% come from Asia. And our racialized population in Canada today is 26%. 4,6 millions de personnes parlent une langue autre que l'anglais ou le français. Les autres langues les plus parlées à la maison sont le tagalog, le punjabi, le mandarin, le cantonais, l'arabe. Les langues autochtones ont connu une légère augmentation de 7% entre 2016 et 2021, principalement en tant que deuxième langue. Près de 35% de la population canadienne n'a aucune croyance religieuse et 53% restent chrétiens. The Muslim population, about 5%, Hindus and Sikhs, about 2%. So if we were to look at our growth on a population clock, every single minute of the entire day, every single minute, an immigrant comes to this country. Every 50 seconds, a non-immigrant comes to this country. And every 21 minutes, somebody leaves this country. Just gives you a scale of at which we are moving. So let's assume that Taiki invited us all here in 20 years. We're sitting here. So you're sitting in the rows, and you look to your left and to your right. 1 in 3 would be born abroad. 1 in 2 would either be an immigrant or would be born to an immigrant. And in fact, 1 out of 4 would come from either Asia or from Africa. At this rate, the black population in Canada will be larger than the Chinese population. And racialized population rate in Canada by 2041 is going to be in excess of 40%. So the question I pose to you is, who are we building this country for? In whose image? Will we take all our biases and our inequities and all the disproportionality that we have and just transpose it into the future? Or are we going to take the needs and the preferences and the wants and desires of those who are going to make this country and be part of the future? And are we going to chase unintended consequences? Or are we going to build them into the way our policy is structured? Statistics Canada, during the course of the pandemic, would have had every reason to say, you know what, people are fighting for their lives. Businesses are fighting for their livelihoods. We don't need to survey them and burden them further. In fact, we did the opposite. We said, when there is fog and we don't know where we're going, we need more data. We need better clarity. And we introduced a series of programs, included a very important one on disaggregated data. So let me just kind of dig into some of the results of that. And let me look at education and labor. 3 in 4 Indigenous people in Canada finish high school. And when you look at on reserve, it's about 55% that finish high school. The median age of Indigenous people in Canada is 8.2 years younger than that of the nation. And in fact, the employment rate on reserve is 56%. If you look at bachelor's degrees of higher attainment for the kids of black people or of African immigrants, you look at their employment, they are overrepresented in a fairly significant way in jobs that actually only require high school or maybe even less, and yet they have bachelor's degrees. Their employment rates lag, and that happens for racialized groups everywhere. Let's focus on the health sector for a minute. 1 in 3 of foreign-trained nurses actually work as nurses in Canada. For doctors, it's not a whole lot better. 2 in 5 actually work as doctors if they're foreign trained. If you happen to be born and trained in Canada, 9 out of 10. We've never seen as many vacancies in Canada in the healthcare sector ever. 147,300, according to our job vacancy and wage survey. And yet, 15%, or more than 5 million Canadians, don't have a regular healthcare provider. We look at mental health, 45% of our healthcare workers told us that their mental health had deteriorated over the course of the last 3 years. 1 in 4 nurses, 1 in 6 personnel who are support workers, 1 in 10 physicians said that they want to leave the profession in the next 3 years. And yet, we're going to see the biggest population that's aged 80 or over than we have ever seen. And as you know, the disproportionate needs for healthcare for them are not going to end for some time yet. Remember what I said, destiny and demography? It's those baby boomers. Environics and the Century Initiative did a poll last October. 69% of those that responded said that they support the current level of immigration. They felt 85% of them felt that immigration has a very positive impact on our economy. Mais 46% estiment toutefois qu'il y a trop d'immigrants qui viennent dans ce pays, qui n'adoptent pas les valeurs canadiennes. We saw hate crimes go up. We saw racism is up like we've never seen before. And of course, immigration doesn't, spread itself evenly within Canada. You look at Toronto, Vancouver, we are going to see populations who are racialized in excess of 70%. If you look at Edmonton, Calgary, Ottawa, in excess of 50% racialized populations by 2041. That is not far. And let's compare that to the rural areas of our country. 5% today are racialized, and they will go to 10%. 2/3 des immigrants permanents s'installent dans les 6 plus grandes villes urbaines du Canada: Toronto, Vancouver, Montréal, Calgary, Edmonton et Ottawa. Nos communautés rurales sont en déclin, mais si les tendances actuelles se maintiennent, le contexte pourrait changer. And so we talk a lot about housing, right? How are we going to house all these immigrants? Well, let me tell you, the challenges are even bigger than that. How do we build inclusive cities and communities with green spaces and wetlands and farmlands and urban parks and daycares and health cares and shopping centers and the transit and the digital infrastructure so that every single person can succeed? Because that's what it's going to take for this country to succeed. Our postal code cannot be the determinant of our income, our social inclusion, our quality of life, of health, or even our mortality. And yet, that's the case today. Reconnaître le clivage français-anglais, en particulier dans les communautés minoritaires, parlant une langue officielle sera important pour garantir l'égalité des chances en matière d'éducation et des prestations de services dans un Canada bilingue. And if you thought that was the end of our challenges, had to sneak that in. Remember, I grew up in Edmonton, so in case you're wondering. Let me transition to the economy. We've always been and are a very strong resource-based economy and a very strong trading nation. Building our nation has been synonymous with building infrastructure. The prosperity that we've had in one part of the country because of that infrastructure has allowed us to share in the wealth in other parts of the country and also cushion when the manufacturing sector or the oil and gas or the mining sector or other sectors were going. It cushioned the blow in other parts of the country. We built railroads starting back in the 1880s. We built pipelines with the discovery of oil back in the 1940s. And we built, of course, highways, including the Trans-Canada Highway between 1962 and 1971. And let me tell you, there's another infrastructure that we've been developing that you may not have seen, but it's the statistical infrastructure. And it has been just as transformative on this country. I mentioned earlier the equalization transfer payments. We are only able to do that because we have a strong data infrastructure, statistical infrastructure. The way that we reallocate taxes, like the HST, the census, and how they factor into a smooth functioning democracy in terms of representation. And we are not just passive providers, and not the exclusive providers, of course. We are woven, just as the physical infrastructure of this country, into its smooth functioning. So our population in the world, we are about less than 0.5%. So if you were to rank population in the world, we'd be 39th. Our economy today is $2 trillion US. We are 9th in terms of the economy, in terms of our size. About 270 billion of that is in rental, leasing, real estate. 195 billion is in manufacturing. 156 billion is in the mining, the quarrying, the oil and gas sector. And then we have about 150 billion, give or take, in some of the other key sectors like construction, finance and insurance, health, and social assistance. We are 3% larger today than we were before the pandemic in terms of our economy. In 2022, our economy grew by 3.4%. We have 865,000 more workers today in the labor force than we did before the pandemic. We see poverty and income inequality actually decrease during the last few years. And that's largely because of course, the income, the employment, more people working, but also government transfers. And you see household disposable incomes actually increased by 20% during the course of the pandemic, and actually even in the lower income quintiles. And we see a savings rate today that is twice that of where it was pre-pandemic. In fact, the deposits in bank accounts today are $160 billion more than they were before. So the ability to demand has gone up. And of course, you see the implication to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. L'indice des prix à la consommation a atteint un maximum de 8,1% en juin 2022 et a depuis ralenti en raison de la diminution des prix de l'énergie, tombant à 4,3% en mars. Les prix élevés des denrées élémentaires, des intérêts hypothécaires et des loyers continuent de déposer de sérieux problèmes à de nombreux Canadiens, en particulier aux jeunes et aux immigrants récents. L'escalade rapide des taux hypothécaires pourrait ajouter environ $1,000 au paiement mensuel habituel. Et, dans le même temps, les augmentations annuelles des prix des nouveaux contrats de location dans de nombreuses villes sont à 2 chiffres. One of the things that we did during the COVID time was a business condition survey to find out how businesses are doing during this time. And in fact, that survey tells us, because we continue it, that businesses are going to still continue to show strong sales. Of course, they're having challenges of high inflation. They're having a labor shortage, labor challenges. And in fact, now many of them are starting to see lower consumer spending, and of course, they're adjusting their investments accordingly. We're seeing, as you know, in Canada, a clearly integrated and highly dependent economy on what's happening globally. But let me tell you, far more so in terms of what's happening in the US, right? Our international trade to bolster our standard of living is going to be absolutely crucial. And COVID, and of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine did quite a number on supply chains and the kind of disruption to trade flows. And we are going to have to continue, just like many other countries, to look at innovative policies to be able to counter some of the mechanisms that are going to be that are being put in place so that those supply chains are resilient and that we in fact have a more environmentally responsible economy and that we continue to have investments and capital flow to this country. And if you look at what happens in the States, what did they put together? The US Inflation Reduction Act, right? You heard of ChatGPT, right? Probably didn't hear about it just a few weeks ago, did you? So now, if we didn't have enough to deal with on the social and environmental side, now we've got this technology. And it seriously threatens to disrupt in a very significant way. Not just, the lower paid, but in fact the very high paid IT sectors as well. And as you know, some have said, enough, can you make the world stop for a few minutes? Well, the world doesn't stop. We don't stop. We're Canadians. We have to step up. Change is going to just continue to come at us. Again, that pace thing that I was talking about. We are a country that's rich in natural resources, and climate change adaptation is both a major challenge, but it's also a major opportunity. We can't miss this next wave. Some argue we missed the natural gas kind of, wave. We can't miss this next wave. We have to figure out how to keep our extractive industries strong with lower environmental footprints, and we need to look at opportunities to better use our rich endowments in areas such as critical minerals and create new supply chains and new forms of wealth in this country. I think we've committed, right? We've committed to reducing our GHG emissions by 40 to 45% by 2030 and to be carbon neutral by 2050. Those are pretty ambitious and impressive targets. We emit about 670 metric ton equivalents of carbon dioxide today, just so you know. Some have pegged the amount of investment that's going to be required to meet those targets to be somewhere between $60 and $160 billion every year. Just let that sink in. Between 60 and 160 billion annually that's going to be required. And so some say, well, just shut the energy sector off. Remember what I said? Makes up $156 billion annually to our economy. You can't just kind of, you do that and let's say you need another 160, that's $320 billion. Where are we going to find that? So the way forward has to be with the energy sector. And it's going to, in fact, take all the sectors, whether it's our building, our transportation, every single sector, to work responsibly to achieve some of those targets. And they're going to each have to contribute in a very significant way. Look, attracting and investing capital is a massive challenge in this country. And you look at our traditional resource industries, they have been the primary draw of that investment capital in this country, in which, as I mentioned, it has this kind of equalizing effect. And, we're going to, that was the reason why we bounced back, by the way, after the previous recession, is because of the investments in our traditional sectors. Il est moins évident de savoir d'où viendra l'élan d'une croissance tirée par les investissements à l'avenir. Les investissements dans les ressources traditionnelles ont permis une croissance équitable dans les ressources traditionnelles et permis une croissance équitable des revenus et ont ouvert la voie à appartenance à la classe moyenne. Deux conditions fondamentales sont absolument nécessaires et très importantes. Premièrement, les entreprises nationales et étrangères doivent investir ici au Canada. Et la deuxième condition est nous devons produire des besoins et des services dont le monde entier a besoin, and that they're willing to pay for it. And yet, as you know, 3/4 of our exports go to the U.S. Energy and automotive sectors, as you know, are absolutely dependent on North American supply chains. We are both partners and competitors. And if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, that is a massive area for both collaboration and competition, and it's going to continue to be a challenge with other countries going in the similar direction. Now, let's switch to productivity. Productivity, as they say, is not everything, but it's almost everything. Our standard of living depends on productivity. And if you look at our labor productivity, it slowed between 2015 and 19, and in fact, it hasn't recovered. And if you start to compare our productivity with that of the US, that gap continues to widen. The US simply out-invests in capital and in human development. We just cannot, as a country, simply afford to grow big and poor. We need to grow big, and the per capita incomes need to keep up with it. So we need to grow our economies commensurate with our population. Compte tenu de nos réalités démographiques, il est difficile d'envisager une augmentation de l'intensité du travail et des taux d'emploi au-delà des niveaux actuels. La faible productivité constitue un frein naturel à la croissance des salaires. Il est difficile d'augmenter les salaires si les entreprises ne gagnent pas plus. Les coûts unitaires de main-d'œuvre ont fortement augmenté au cours de la pandémie et sont 17% plus élevés aujourd'hui qu'avant la pandémie. Look, we're a country with the lowest deficit in the G7. We have the best debt to GDP ratio. And yet our federal debt is now $1.2 trillion. Our deficit, $43 billion. Just the servicing cost annually is $44 billion. The challenge is how do we grow our economy while maintaining the costs of an expanding social infrastructure? Of course, agile regulatory systems are going to be crucial. Remaining responsible and inclusive. Provinces and territories being part of this development. And of course, Indigenous governments have to be part of shaping our future. Does this all sound a little overwhelming to you? And yet, let me tell you, there isn't a country out there that wouldn't trade their problems for ours. 58% of our working age population has a college or university credential, highest in the world. Nous nous classons parmi les 10 premiers pays de l'OCDE où les inégalités de revenus sont les plus fiables et où le sentiment d'appartenance à la communauté est supérieur à la moyenne. Nous restons extrêmement compétitifs pour attirer et retenir les immigrants et les meilleurs talents avec le niveau élevé de soutien national. We have the best public service in Canada, right? In the world. World leaders in information technology, in artificial intelligence, in machine learning, in responsible data management, and of course, statistics. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Demography shapes our destiny. The role of immigration is absolutely crucial. Inclusion and diversity are our strengths. our challenges of managing the intersection point between our society, our technology, the economy, and our environment are going to be absolutely crucial to shaping our future in this rapidly evolving and competitive world. How do we know these things? Well, because we have a great knowledge system through which, as you know, our agency works hard at every single day to make sure that you have the information at your disposal. Nothing that I've told you is a secret today. It's all freely available. Just go to our website, look at the myriad of things that you can access. We've created hubs and portals that bring data across different domains and provide insights from the hundreds of survey programs. The Census of the Environment, the first of its kind in the world. The Canadian Centre for Energy Information, that brings energy and environment and people aspects together. The Quality of Life Hub, that goes beyond GDP on wellness. There are 84 indicators in 5 different domains. Gender Diversity and Inclusion Statistics Hub. Statistics on the Métis, the Inuit, and the First Nations that build greater Indigenous data sovereignty and capacity. We've got Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, we've got the Canadian Indicator Framework, which is a subset of that. So as we invest in innovative policy, people, and infrastructure, we equally need to continue to invest in the critical data infrastructure. And we need to understand where we are, where are we going, what are we trying to achieve, what works and what doesn't work. We do not have resources or time to waste. It's the intricate relationships between these aspects, and the data allow us to see that and be efficient and effective in what we're doing. We need to build in data strategies at the onset. To see faster is to act faster, and that agility is our competitive advantage. Notre travail consiste à éliminer la complexité et à mettre en évidence les interconnexions grâce à des données et des informations de haute qualité. Et nous pouvons et devons le faire de manière responsable, tout en protégeant la vie privée et la confidentialité. Il ne s'agit pas d'une compromise. It's not a trade-off. Nous disposons de cadres de nécessité et de proportionnalité de premier plan, élaborés avec nos collègues du Conseil du Trésor et du commissariat à la protection de la vie privée. Nous disposons de cadres de bonne gouvernance et d'éthique que des autres organisations peuvent s'approprier. Nous disposons d'ateliers et de séminaires sur les normes et la maîtrise des données pour nous aider à aller de l'avant. Data truly is a team sport. Our sole objective is public good. We're not competing. New data sources and partnerships are absolutely key so that we can reduce burden, we can provide timely insights, we can actually have good standards, ensure interoperability with privacy and confidentiality. And we are expanding those partnerships. We're working with the Chambers of Commerce, with the Business Council. We are working with businesses that can now make use of microdata with confidentiality that's built in. This is not theory. The Business Data Lab exists and is being used. We have a network of 32 regional data centers all across this country, coast to coast, including virtual data access now, where Canadian data researchers, through our Canadian Research Data Center Network, brings new data sources and our academics together, and they produce thousands of papers and new insights every single year. These partnerships are absolutely crucial if we're going to have that knowledge base that's going to move us forward. Our partnerships with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, our First Nations Governance Center, the Métis, Inuit, and the First Nations organizations, and we are helping build data management capacity. Of course, we've got a long history of working with provinces, justice for 40 years, education for 25 years, and we're hoping to play even a key role on the health data file. Avec nos collègues fédéraux, vous, grâce au renouvellement de la stratégie de gouvernement fédéral relative aux données, avec nos collègues dans les médias, Thank you very much. You allow citizens to use good data, to counter misinformation, and to fuel engaged and informed debate. And of course, Taiki with the school. They've been amazing partners at making sure that we increase our numeracy and literacy skills in the public service as well as in our population. We take full advantage of our technical advisory committees and of course our Canadian Statistics Advisory Council. Look, governments alone, let alone one level of government, is going to be able to tackle all this and build this future. It's going to take everybody. It's going to take governments, it's going to take the private sector, it's going to take civil society, it's going to take academics, researchers, it's going to take all of us to build that future that Canada and Canadians deserve. And of course, Statistics Canada will be right there, right alongside, as a key player, and will remain at your service, playing this data stewardship role. We bring, of course, over 100 years of expertise. Thank you. Merci.
So that was pretty much what we in the business call a tour de force of Canada from 1867 to today. And there's nothing like cutting through noise and looking at data to start to understand issues. And in Canada, we are really blessed with Statistics Canada. Statistics Canada is, if not the best statistical agency in the world consistently, it is right up there. And in a world of misinformation, in a world of change, in a world of rapidly changing understandings of what is true and what is false, we have a North Star, and that's a pretty big asset that we're going to utilize in the years to come going forward. So j'aimerais commencer un peu avec Chantal. Chantal, peut-être vous pouvez donner vos réflexions à cette séance de nos collègues.
Je pense d'abord, avant tout, je traduis probablement le sentiment de tout le monde. C'était tout à fait spectaculaire. Merci beaucoup, Anil. And beyond that, as a privacy lawyer, I see the team that Anil refers to, saying statistics are teamwork. I see the personal data behind the statistics. If Statistics Canada can give us such tremendous insights that support our sound public policies, it is because it has 400 programs. It is because it has now the courage to go get disaggregated data. However, we need to, talking about inflection point, we need to face this central question at the moment with the power of data. So we now have unprecedented volumes of data. We have data that is no longer just static, it is dynamic, which is what makes Jim Basili say data is not the new oil, it's the new plutonium, because data produces more data. And it does so autonomously, like we don't even know what is produced about us. So in this context, you see the extraordinary power of statistics to ground even better public policy. But you also see the need to ensure it happens with full respect of the individual. And I am reassured, if I can say so, in seeing initiatives that are emerging that I believe will assist Statistics Canada in pursuing this courageous work. The first one is in a bill that is in the House of Commons right now. Bill C-27 proposes 3 bills, but one of them reforms our private sector privacy law. And it contains a provision that will allow companies to disclose de-identified data, I'll explain what it is in a moment, de-identified data to government institutions such as Statistics Canada for socially beneficial purposes. We've never had that before. Socially beneficial purpose is defined as a purpose for health, for public amenities, for environment, and so on. And de-identified data is not anonymized. It's data that is still traceable, meaning that with a secondary source, you can still go back to individuals. So we're not talking about deep anonymized data, we're talking about personal data, and yet it will be possible to give it to government organizations under a framework of optimization of data. The Quebec legislation for privacy law has just been reformed, giving these same parameters. And so I just want to put this on the table that we need to truly address the challenge of optimizing data in full respect of privacy so that we can continue to produce this kind of quality of statistics.
Yeah, Jim calls it plutonium. I'll do him one better. I call it oxygen. It is critical to the state. And the linkages between the origins of the state and data, they're almost one and the same. You can see them in every country in the Western world and in the Eastern, much of the Eastern world, where data and statehood go hand in hand. I want to flip now to Goldie, and if Anil is a little bit of a Cassandra today, Goldie is, no, sorry, the opposite. Anil is a little bit of a Pollyanna today. Goldie is a little grumpy today. So Goldie will play the role of Cassandra. Anil started by saying that we're at an inflection point in Canada. And when we have you come to the school to talk to ADMs and future deputy ministers, you say something very similar. You say we're in a very serious time. And that's how you start almost all your talks at the school. We're in a very serious time. Tell us a little bit what you felt and how you reacted to all the stuff that Anil was going through.
Well, first of all, thank you, Taki, for the invite, and how proud I am of my friend Anil here for taking, as you said, a tour de force. I listened very carefully to what was said, and I think it just underscores my point about what a serious time in which we live. And I don't talk about it in the context of just Canada. I often start my remarks by saying, take a look at democracies around the world. Democracies are in decline around the world. There are less of them today than there were just 25 years ago. So if you're keeping score, we're losing. And you have to ask yourself, why? If we believe we have the best system, we have the best values, we have the open society, the inclusive, diverse, all of that stuff, why are we losing? And part of the reason we're losing is that capital is agnostic to ideology, and capital is agnostic to nationality. Growth and economic investment comes in places where capital is welcome, where there's a stable, predictable regulatory regime, where there's a depoliticization of our regulatory systems, and a place where success and growth is ambitious and not punished. Culturally, many of these democracies have been, and I say this with the greatest of respect, not judging what I'm about to say, but they've become playgrounds for special interests. How many of our political parties now call themselves movements? I never studied movements in political science school as a political party. I studied political parties. And yet, it means that they become responsive. So part of the issue here is we're losing our political leaders in our democracies. They're being followers. And so what we're trying to do in the business community is to raise some of these issues in a responsible, honest, candid way, because we love this country. We want to see it achieve her full potential. But when I listen to my friend, if I can just go systematically about what I would say are the 5 I's, if you will, and there may be more, but he talked about immigration. So yes, there's a tremendous positive story about immigration. We've worked very hard with our political parties to say, do us one favor, don't politicize this issue. We are not such a special people that if you're not baited and goaded to going to the dark corners of, xenophobia, you know our history as well as I do. It's not pure. It's not clean. Going back from the indigenous to the Japanese to the Chinese to the Sikhs to the Jews, we're not clean. So don't goad us into that place. And thankfully, our major political parties have left immigration largely alone. And now we've gotten the numbers up to where we need to be at 500,000 per year. The content of that is a separate issue. But overall, we're getting immigration right. But we're also getting some things wrong. We dupe people into coming into this country and telling them we're going to recognize their value of their education. We give them points on that system. Then we don't let them work in those areas. So our foreign skills accreditation has got to get better. We have an immigration backlog of 2.7 million people. It's declining, and I know they're working at it, but good people don't wait. Good people move on. There will always be people. If there's one human being breathing, they'll want to live in Canada. But is it the one you want? Is it the one you need? We have to be smarter about how we recruit, and that means you have to do a better job delivering the immigration system of itself. Inflation. Governments of every stripe in every jurisdiction are spending money like they're drunken sailors. There's no end to it. We all know how this movie ends. You in public service know better than anybody from 1993. It ends badly. It will result in cuts. It will result in job losses. It will result in pain. And we're trying to advocate to grow an economy that can keep up with the spending. No one seems to be as obsessed with growing the economy than business leaders are about the need to grow that economy. So inflation is another example, right? If you look at innovation, you know, we're going to need to innovate our way out of so many of our problems, but innovation requires a lot of capital and a lot of talent, right? We're slow. We're reactionary in many of these places. We're very good at it when we get to it, but we're slow to that. Take a look at interprovincial trade barriers, another example of an own goal. Okay? And I can just go on and on, I won't have time, but every one of these things that I've just mentioned are own goals. You can't blame the United States, you can't blame China, you can't blame Donald Trump. These are self-imposed own goals that result in a budget that shows us with no growth. I take no pleasure in pointing this out. It's not my budget, it's the government's budget. It shows no growth. So you're smart people. How are we going to meet the challenges that Anil laid out with a shrinking population, shrinking revenues, and increasing demand?
But
how are we going to do that?
Not a shrinking population, a growing population.
In working-wise, what we're going to see is less people, especially with AI and all these other things. There's going to be, we know history.
A smaller workforce.
A smaller workforce. How are we going to respond?
So Dr. LaFontaine, I want to bring you in here.
Be positive.
Coincidentally.
Healthcare. What could you possibly say bad about healthcare?
Exactly. Coincidentally, this year, as we speak, you are currently the president of the Canadian Medical Association. Anil talked to us about the challenges that are happening in terms of not only the people that are in the system right now, the people that we literally depend on for life and death at certain moments, the doctors and the nurses, but also the people that have been trained in other countries to come to perform these tasks. And Anil's statistics were kind of sobering. Only 2 out of 5 foreign-trained doctors, only 1 out of 3 foreign-trained nurses have their credentials recognized. There seems to be something wrong here. And I know that you're the head of a national association that is largely delivered provincially. But there seems to be some kind of disconnect where we have people who are burning out and leaving the profession while on the very same moment having people that are trained in these areas driving taxis and working in restaurants.
Yeah, well, first off, thanks for inviting me to the panel, and I always enjoy listening to you speak, but there was a couple things in your presentation that really had me thinking about kind of this story of healthcare. And when it comes to data, I think we fooled ourselves in previous years that somehow we were the objective arbiters of things, right? Someone definitely has to be an arbiter of truth. I think that's needed more now than ever. Someone has to say, you know, up is up and down is down, gravity is gravity. And usually persons who are most respectful and objective with the data, that's the most true. But I think the other thing that we've learned in recent years is that in collecting and sharing data, we're actually sharing a story. And we can't ignore that in how we shape things. And I think in healthcare, we were probably the biggest violators of this rule, right? We pretended like we were objective, uninvolved passengers on this journey of how the healthcare system grew. And as a result, we're in this mess that we are right now where, you know, folks who come here to immigrate who are skilled in areas, you know, only 2 in 5 work. You know, and I think on an individual level, that's a travesty. I think on a system level, increasingly people just know that doesn't make any sense, right? And so how can we explain this in less than 3 minutes? Let me try, okay? So in the 1950s and 60s, healthcare was going to your local hospital or clinic. If you couldn't get care there, you were out of luck. There was no traveling to a different town. There was not flying across the country. There was just that one place. So as demand grew and as the system started to come into its own, we started replicating those clinics and hospitals, really just creating mirror images. So if there are 10 people that worked at one hospital, there'd be 10 in whatever we built next. And we spread these across the country. Eventually, we ran into a resource constraint where we didn't have enough people with the skills that we needed to provide those services, and we ran out of space and equipment. And so as a result, in the late 90s, we segmented things. Our hospitals went from, you could get trauma, if you broke your leg and you went to a hospital, you could only go to one hospital in town versus the 5 different hospitals that used to be able to treat you. Over time, we started to run into resource limits with that as well, so then we leaned into technology. And so we started adopting these different methods of doing things faster, more efficient, or tracking, all these other things. Now, those 3 things are actually the source of all of our problems right now. So we scaled at a rate where we fragmented the system and we don't even know where our resource assets are. You know, we have 93,000, which I think is a good number, but when you look at some of the other data sets, they count folks who don't even live in the country. I sit on a board with Chris Hadfield, and he was saying I was in space, and they were counting me as a family physician that, you know, could provide care in the area that I live, you know, which I guess maybe you could do with virtual care, but.
It'd be pretty expensive.
Very expensive, very expensive. And so we continue to approach things in the same way that we always have, regardless of what the data is telling us, right? So we have a limitation in OR space because we don't have enough people to people those places. What do? We go build new places. We create public-private partnerships to create more physical space when it's actually the people that are the problem. Our information systems haven't kept up with what's going on. We don't actually know within, you know, a catchment of 5 hospitals, like in downtown Toronto, where our bottlenecks are. You know, which OR has a shortage of nurses, which one has a shortage of anesthesiologists, which one has a shortage of surgeons or cleaning folks, or all these different people who are members of these teams. And so I think that in hearing about the other panelists and kind of their comments on different things, you know, the running theme is that we're still leaning into the same ways that we thought about things. So what are some things that are different? Well, Chantal was talking about how, you know, this idea that privacy is paramount over everything is actually not true. People don't mind having their identity known if they get some value out of it, right? But what's the problem with data sharing in healthcare right now? You're not actually asking people whether or not they want data. You're asking stewards of data who control this aggregated data whether or not it's okay for them to share, and they don't feel that it's worth the risk. So they actually don't care about the value add. You know, Alberta Health Services, which I work in and I have a lot of affinity for, it's the largest holder of health data probably in North America right now. It is impossible to get access to data for research that would lead to benefit to small cohorts of folks, people with rare disease or other things. And it's because it's a stewardship model versus a value-based exchange model. You know, when we talk about what's going on with the world and, you know, where the behavior of capital going to where it's treated best, I mean, why are people leaving the healthcare system? It's because they're not treated well, but we don't measure any of that. You know, we measure throughput. We measure how much things cost per widget, whether or not we can do that faster to lower cost. But we don't bother to ask, is it terrible where you work? You know, when's the last time you slept? Why are you crying in the hallway? You know, all of these questions we're not asking. And it reminds me of an experience I had very early on in my training where I was walking on one side with an epidemiologist, on the other side was an elder in the community. This is like a setup for a joke, but we're walking past, you know, this area that has a lot of persons who are homeless. And the epidemiologist is kind of telling me about the history and all these other things. And the elder turns to me and says, I don't disagree with anything that they said, but the system does not believe those people matter unless they're counted and put into a study. When you can actually walk over to those people and ask them directly whether or not things are better. And so I think in the story of data, we have to get a lot more specific about what are we trying to get out at the other side and just acknowledge that the world has changed. The rules that we're building our decisions on were made for a world that no longer exists. You know, and I think in the story of healthcare that we try and share at the CMA, the 2 things that we're trying to aim for is access for patients and healthy working environments for providers. And I think data really helps us to tell that story in a different way.
And absolutely, and we're going to come back to data and healthcare and aging in Canada. Nil was telling us how, you know, the population of people who are 80 and over, the big consumers of healthcare, is growing more dramatically than the rest of the population. And there are people in this audience who know very well what you're speaking of. During COVID, one of the biggest challenges, and it was unspoken, but one of the biggest challenges was simply getting data. The federal government and the provinces and hospitals getting data at the right time when they needed it. Now, Althea, I left you to last because you're the professional. You're the one we see on TV. You're the one that knows how to handle sitting there patiently for 7-8 minutes going, I disagree with that.
That's usually Andrew.
You know, we see you on TV, but your day job is writing at the Toronto Star, and that's, you know, one of Canada's biggest newspapers in one of the world's great multicultural cities. Tell us a little bit about the immigration story that Anil talked to us about. Like, what does, because it plays out differentially across the country, whether you're in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, or in the rural part of Canada. And as Anil was going through that, I was a little bit worried that you kind of, you know, you started to see two Canadas emerging, and where your postal code was, that determined not only your quality of life, but largely what you believe and what you don't believe.
And what your future can be. Yeah, I just want to say from the outset, I thought it was so refreshing to hear you speak, and it made me realize we don't hear our political leaders at all talk about the challenge ahead in the same way, in a serious way, and so nobody is trying to address it because they are not speaking about it. And,
Yeah.
oh. Boo.
I'm clapping for a no.
Yes. Do you want to run?
No, that's a very clear answer.
So a few things I want to say about immigration and the challenge and the opportunities that you laid out for us. One of the things that I worry about a lot is polarization and division, and how to make sure that the fabric of society continues to knit us together, and we're seeing that increasingly fall apart. When I started, when I was like a baby reporter, one of my first interviews was with Jason Kenney, who was then the immigration minister. I was working at the Ottawa Sun at the time, and he said, "Canada is not a hotel." I think that was the front page of the paper that day. But he's right. We cannot have communities living in silos, not integrating with the rest of society, not feeling like the rest of the society cares about them and wants to see them succeed. And that message, I think you see it now resonating in Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader's discourse, when he talks about foreign credentials, which Goldie talked about, which you talked about, people who feel left out of the system. And we have to make sure going forward that people feel like they're an equal partner, and we all want to see everybody succeed. Back to the postal codes. I worry, obviously, I'm in a cultural industry, I worry about the lack of cultural institutions that help talk and speak to that story of Canada and where we want the country to go and who's represented and how we can all be included in that. And conflict here. Obviously, I'm on the CBC and I care about the CBC and I want the CBC to do well, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the CBC who was telling those stories. It just has been that, you know, in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, it was the CBC telling those stories. Probably up until the 2000s, you see there was polling by Abacus last week that suggests that most young people see no value in the CBC. The Generation Z has no interest in the CBC, and that goes to where we get our media and who's telling us stories. And I think that also has to be part of the story and the challenge going forward, because increasingly people are taking a siloed view about where they're getting their information. I'm very worried about the future of news media, or traditional old media, I guess. But I don't know that we'll still be around in 25 years. And so, you know, you compound the fact that there may not be professional media organizations the way we think about them at the moment in the future, that our society might explode. We didn't even talk about climate migration, but I feel like that will be another wave as well. So we will have all these stresses in the system, and who is going to knit us together. And I say this because you see political advantage from political parties trying to actually sow division and create an us versus them dynamic. Obviously, we saw it in the United States, but even in legislation like Bill 21 and Bill 96 in Quebec, and the rhetoric that we've seen in the last election from the CAQ government. So I think we need to be really careful about who's telling that story and demanding better from our political leaders to make sure that that we're all included in that conversation.
Yeah. So you said something that was really interesting, and you said that our institutions, in a way, you used to say our institutions used to knit us together, and they don't seem to be knitting us together anymore as well as they did in the past. And I want to test a little thesis out here. Now, after the last election, you mentioned the P word, politicians, which is we're all very allergic to in this audience. But let's, at the risk of getting fired, let's talk a little bit about it. You wrote a great article after the last election in the Toronto Star about kind of, and I hope one day you turn it into a book, but you wrote a great article, and what really caught me on that article was the role of data. And you were talking about, and it's not a secret, it's, advertisers do it, politicians do it, universities do it, everybody on Facebook, Twitter does it, micro-targeting. And in the past, when we didn't have data, we used to kind of try to appeal to Canadians writ large. And the old saying was kind of the votes are in the middle. But today, the votes kind of aren't in the middle. The votes are kind of at the margin because you now have the capacity to micro-target somebody in any one of the 338 ridings and kind of not pay attention to Canada per se, but to pay attention to Bob and Mill and Mary and who's going to go vote. Maybe tell us a little bit about micro-targeting in politics. And then I'm going to have Anil talk a little bit, maybe take that so that we can be fired together, to maybe talk a little bit about kind of some of the not the dark side of data, but some of the ways that you can take data and make it to a point of self-interest that it becomes defeatist in a pan-Canadian context.
I'm not sure I'm going to say anything to this crowd that you don't already know, but actually, let me start. A few weeks ago, I think it was 2 weeks ago, the Prime Minister was speaking at a town hall, and he was asked a question by a student, and he said one of his greatest regrets was on electoral reform, how he didn't use the opportunity that he had to bring forward a preferential ballot. And I thought, wow, and it didn't really kind of get in the media, but we spent so much time talking about electoral reform, and it was always about a PR system. And then he admitted that actually when he decided to scrap his promise at that June press conference several years ago now that, well, he always wanted a PR system, but he always wanted a preferential ballot, but he never told anybody that was actually what he wanted to do. He never tried to get the committee members to study a preferential ballot. And for those of just a preferential ballot is the way the Conservatives and the Liberals pick their leader is who would you rather have in your riding? Okay, I would rather have the New Democrats, I would put them 1, and maybe the Liberals would be number 2, and the Conservatives would be 3, and PPC number 4, for example. And the Greens, I guess, number 5. Or the Bloc, I guess, whatever, doesn't matter. And a preferential ballot it forces candidates to actually be nicer to each other because you are going after the same group of people. And yeah, you don't have to put 2, 3, 4, 5 on your ballot, but it encourages the tone of the conversation to be more civil. And that's why, frankly, you see political parties use it in their own elections because it's the way to get kind of to a middle ground candidate. Most people will have a choice that is acceptable to them. We don't obviously have that system with first past the post, and increasingly what we see is that political parties don't try to convince you to vote for them. they do not waste the time and the resources because it's actually kind of expensive to go out and to convince a voter that is unlikely to vote for them to vote for you. So they focus on the voters that they know are more likely to vote for you, and then they go out and make sure that those people are informed about the vote, that they send cars to get them to the polling station to vote for them. And they try to move them on many different issues. And throughout the campaign, especially through social media, we see them test different messages to the same group of voters to find an issue that will move them. If you said that you like climate change, you'll get a bunch of different ads that push you towards climate change. And they'll use different ridings as mini laboratories to test different messages, and then they will push out their message. And increasingly, we're seeing messages based on identity and values as opposed to public policy issues. We've always had wedge issues because, frankly, it's successful. It makes you like hot and bothered, and you're like, guns, I hate guns, I'm gonna go vote against guns, or I hate abortion, I'm gonna go vote against abortion. And it actually brings in the money too, or the fact that we are heavily dependent. Now we don't have the per vote subsidy for political parties. Those hot button issues mobilize the base, you get more money, the volunteers get mobilized, so it's very successful, but we don't have this kind of coherent message that would be more appealing to a general audience, and we're seeing the loss of that, I feel,
and
increasingly.
I think what Althea is saying, and I'm going to paraphrase you and whack me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're saying is data, 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 and in some ways, political parties came to understand the power of data far faster than some of the people in our institution, because political parties, whether they're red, blue, orange, purple, yellow, what have you, they need data, and they need data to be successful, and they need data to win. And the fact that they're very sophisticated in data is something that shouldn't surprise us. Now, I'm down to our last 5 minutes, so I feel like we're just starting, but I'm going to kind of go in reverse order. Give us like a last. You're talking to a group of largely public servants. You're also going to be talking to nerds on CPAC when we rebroadcast this at some point later. Give us a little bit of wisdom on data. Nil, I'm going to leave you to the end. Give us a little bit of data, or a little bit of wisdom on data to the public service and to the nerds that will be watching this on CPAC one day. I'm going to start the opposite order, so Chantal.
Break the silos.
Break the silos.
That's what I would say. Apparently my microphone does not work. Apologies.
Well, you broke the microphone, so then we'll break the silos.
So break the silos is what I would say. I am so in agreement with Alika. Just this morning, I received an email from a police service who has asked me to help them share data. Therefore, integrate privacy into data sharing. Privacy is not an impediment, it's a modality. That would be my message.
Goldie, what would you tell us about data?
Two things. One is we have more information, more content, more data than probably we've ever had before, and we're dumber. And that's a problem. And the reason we're dumber is we've grown up in an era now that is allowed to talk about alternate facts. We have an entire constituency of people out there who will tell you on the day that there's a pouring rain that it's the brightest sunny day, and it will be reported as a bright sunny day, and they will believe it, and they will question the validity of the rain being shown. And that is a bizarre world to live in. But I will say, never waste a good crisis. I never waste a crisis. I get crises aren't good. But we've gone through a few things, whether it was COVID, whether it's the war, whether it's the issues around climate change, where those of us who are in the business community are saying the facts are still the facts. So recently the Prime Minister said, I realized that I was wrong about nuclear. Well, we've been saying nuclear has to be a part of the mix to get net zero. Our facts never change. Those were always the facts. And so these crises that are coming about are reintroducing the opportunity to bring back the facts to the center of the room, because you're not entitled to your own facts.
Althea.
Don't forget that the humans are the ones behind the data.
Dr. Lafontaine.
So it's tough to go forth because all the good stuff has been taken. So I would say that data does not survive observation in the same form. As soon as you look at data, it changes, you know? And when you're using data, you're on two parts of a continuum. You're either creating space for people to fill that data with their own meaning, or you're helping people shape meaning from the data in the way that you want them to kind of take it. And so be very, very acutely aware of where you are on that continuum and tie it back to what you're actually trying to accomplish. Because at the end of the day, I think one of the things that drives me crazy about the polarized conversations that we have nowadays, they're not pragmatic. We're not actually trying to achieve anything. And I think that that's really at the core of why things are spiraling down.
Now, Anil, I'm about to give you the last word as the 2023 Mannion Lecture. You have just heard from the 2024 Mannion Lecture. So Dr. Alika Lafontaine will be giving the lecture next year on healthcare. But before we go to 2024, let's finish 2023.
Well, I think so. A lot's been said that I absolutely agree with. One is volume does not automatically equate to quality, okay? You can have all the data you want, and it's not going to solve the problem for you. A lot of times it's the human that's the missing link, or somebody who's trying to manipulate things. And I would say being a wary, informed consumer, I think is really important. And so if you go to organizations from which the data are not telling you the quality, and that's all its different dimensions, and they're not being transparent about how it is that they went about putting it together, don't trust it. Be a little skeptical. Ask that second and third question. Don't just go for it. And yeah, new technologies, which are, they're just huge vacuum cleaners of new data. I would say a healthy dose of skepticism there as well, because we are going to take all the biases that were there in the data. If we don't understand the standards, the definitions on which they were collected, and we're just going to pump them through new technologies, what do you think is going to happen? We're just going to exacerbate those kinds of issues. So I do think the laws and the frameworks and the practices that are being put in place are going to be absolutely crucial. And the last point I will make is trust is everything. I think a lot of the panelists here talked about trust. And the trust only comes about when we have good ethical frameworks. We have frameworks like necessity and proportionality, and where we haven't looked at privacy and confidentiality as somehow trade-offs, but they're integrated into how it is that we're driving outcomes that matter for Canadians. And I think data is a key piece.